There is a quiet difference in how certain people relate to money, not louder ambition or cleverness, but a subtle calm formed long before wealth ever became possible. Those raised in the 1970s learned money through absence and delay, through watching adults hesitate before spending, through environments where certainty rarely existed and comfort was not assumed. Their psychology formed in an era where progress felt unstable, where inflation eroded trust, and where institutions appeared permanent yet unreliable at the same time. What appears today as restraint or emotional distance toward wealth is often mistaken for conservatism, when it is actually memory encoded as instinct. They do not chase money loudly, they do not romanticize it. Instead, they approach it with a quiet seriousness shaped by early exposure to limitation. While later generations associate wealth with expression and visibility, this group associates it with insulation, privacy, and reduced exposure to uncertainty. The unsettling truth is that their financial calm does not come from optimism, but from an early understanding that systems can fail without warning. They learned that survival required patience, that rewards arrive slowly, and that stability was built quietly rather than announced. In conversations about money, they often sound emotionally detached, yet beneath that detachment lies a deeply emotional relationship with risk and loss. This mindset did not emerge from privilege alone, but from growing up during a period where economic narratives were fragmented and trust had to be self-constructed. The core psychological difference lies in how uncertainty was processed during formative years, shaping how wealth is perceived as a buffer rather than a symbol. Behavioral psychology shows that early exposure to scarcity calibrates long-term risk tolerance, teaching the nervous system to prioritize security over stimulation. For those raised in the 1970s, money became associated with control over chaos, not with freedom of identity or personal expression. They learned to separate emotional satisfaction from spending, a pattern reinforced by environments where indulgence was rare and often questioned. This created a mindset where accumulation felt safer than consumption, and where restraint was rewarded internally even when unnoticed externally. Unlike modern wealth psychology driven by visibility, their financial behavior is guided by avoidance of vulnerability rather than pursuit of status. They do not expect systems to protect them, so they internalize responsibility for future stability through disciplined financial behaviors. Loss aversion plays a dominant role, as early memories taught them that losing ground is harder than gaining it, and recovery is never guaranteed. This leads to conservative strategies that appear cautious, but are actually optimized for psychological peace rather than maximum returns. Their patience is not strategic in the modern sense, but habitual, formed through repeated experiences of waiting without certainty of outcome. Delayed gratification was not taught as a virtue, it was enforced by circumstance, embedding itself as a default behavioral response. They are less reactive to short-term gains because emotional excitement was rarely associated with money in their early environment. Instead, money was discussed in hushed tones, often tied to worry, responsibility, and long-term planning rather than opportunity. This emotional framing created adults who view wealth as something to be managed quietly, not enjoyed publicly or discussed casually. They often mistrust sudden financial growth, associating rapid change with instability rather than success. In behavioral terms, their reward circuitry responds more strongly to consistency than to novelty, shaping conservative investment preferences. They do not seek validation through wealth display because wealth itself served as a shield, not a signal, during formative years. This group often underplays success, downplaying income or assets, as visibility historically increased perceived risk. Their financial decisions are guided by an internal sense of safety calibration rather than external benchmarks of achievement. Ultimately, their wealth psychology is rooted in emotional regulation, where money exists to reduce anxiety rather than amplify pleasure. In everyday life, this psychology appears quietly, in how they choose homes with solid structures over fashionable locations, valuing permanence over impression. They often keep older cars longer than expected, not from frugality alone, but from a learned respect for reliability over novelty. When promotions arrive, they pause before celebrating, mentally calculating downside scenarios before allowing satisfaction to surface. In social settings, they rarely discuss income, redirecting conversations toward work ethic or long-term plans, preserving privacy as a form of safety. They may dress simply despite financial comfort, unconsciously avoiding attention that once signaled exposure or vulnerability. During economic booms, they remain emotionally flat, remembering previous cycles where optimism preceded sudden contraction. They prefer ownership to leverage, choosing slower accumulation over borrowed acceleration that feels psychologically unstable. In partnerships, they often insist on financial clarity early, not from distrust, but from an internal need to reduce unknown variables. They keep emergency funds larger than advisors recommend, because emotional memory overrides abstract statistical reassurance. When friends chase speculative opportunities, they observe quietly, withholding judgment while declining participation. They negotiate calmly, without visible urgency, because urgency historically signaled loss of control. Their workplaces see them as steady performers, rarely dramatic, rarely reactive, yet consistently present during difficult periods. They respect authority cautiously, shaped by witnessing institutions that appeared powerful yet failed individuals silently. Even leisure is structured, vacations planned well ahead, expenses anticipated, surprises minimized to maintain internal equilibrium. They often mentor younger colleagues indirectly, modeling restraint rather than preaching discipline. When markets fluctuate, they check less frequently, not from ignorance, but from learned emotional detachment towards short-term movement. They value tangible outcomes, property, skills, relationships, over abstract promises of future gain. In family settings, they emphasize preparedness, passing down quiet warnings rather than optimistic assurances. Their generosity is discreet, preferring private assistance over public philanthropy that attracts attention. What appears conservative behaviorally is often a sophisticated emotional strategy refined through decades of lived uncertainty. Beneath these patterns lies a nervous system shaped by repeated exposure to unresolved tension, teaching calm not as confidence but as self-preservation. Early environments trained them to scan for instability, embedding hyper-awareness that later translated into financial vigilance. Their relationship with money is inseparable from emotional regulation, where wealth functions as a tool to quiet internal noise. This creates an internal reward system that values reduced anxiety over increased excitement, altering how success is neurologically registered. They experience satisfaction when risk is contained, not when gains are maximized, reversing modern narratives of ambition. Attachment theory suggests their security style leans towards self-reliance, reducing dependence on external validation or institutional guarantees. Money becomes a boundary, defining what cannot intrude, rather than a means to expand social reach. Their restraint is often misread as lack of desire, when it is actually desire filtered through caution and memory. They learned early that visibility invites scrutiny, and scrutiny increases vulnerability, shaping a preference for quiet control. Cognitively, they discount optimistic projections, weighting negative outcomes more heavily due to early pattern recognition. This bias is not pessimism, but a calibrated realism born from environments where promises were frequently broken. Emotionally, they struggle to fully enjoy abundance, as comfort feels temporary rather than guaranteed. Wealth therefore accumulates alongside a persistent readiness for loss, creating an unusual coexistence of success and vigilance. Socially, they bond through reliability rather than excitement, trusting those who remain consistent under pressure. They avoid dependency, fearing not poverty itself but the emotional exposure that dependency once created. Their self-identity separates worth from possessions, because possessions historically disappeared while character remained. Control becomes the primary emotional driver, with money acting as the most effective instrument of that control. They rarely articulate this internal logic, as much of it operates below conscious awareness. What others call discipline is often a trauma-informed adaptation that quietly rewards predictability. At its deepest level, this psychology is not about wealth accumulation, but about maintaining psychological sovereignty in an uncertain world. Some viewers return to this channel quietly, not for answers, but to observe patterns that rarely surface in ordinary conversation. If this way of seeing feels familiar, you may choose to remain here, not out of loyalty, but out of shared temperament. This space exists for those who prefer understanding over reassurance. If following these observations feels like sitting beside a calm witness rather than a teacher, you may subscribe, not as commitment, but as alignment with a way of thinking. Many assume wealth from this generation came easily, overlooking the emotional cost of vigilance that shaped every financial decision. The myth of natural discipline hides years of internal tension disguised as calm behavior. Their restraint is often praised without recognizing the anxiety that originally produced it. People mistake silence about money for humility, ignoring its roots in learned self-protection. Another misconception is that they lack ambition, when ambition simply took a quieter form. They are assumed to fear risk irrationally, when their caution reflects lived pattern recognition. The belief that wealth brings relaxation ignores how comfort can feel temporary to them. Observers romanticize their patience without understanding it was rarely a choice. Their success is credited to strategy, while emotional endurance remains invisible. It is assumed they distrust people, when in truth they distrust instability. Their reluctance to celebrate wealth is misread as ingratitude. They are thought to hoard resources when they are actually hoarding predictability. The narrative of financial wisdom overlooks the emotional toll of constant readiness. What looks like balance often masks unresolved alertness. The darkest truth is that wealth did not remove uncertainty, it only made it quieter. Those raised in the 1970s carry wealth differently, not as triumph, but as a negotiated peace with unpredictability. Their calm is not lightness, but weight held steadily over time. They move through prosperity without illusion, aware that conditions can change without explanation. Money never became a fantasy, it remained a tool against intrusion. Their psychology resists celebration because celebration invites forgetting. They remember too well how quickly comfort dissolves. This memory shapes a form of wealth that feels private and emotionally guarded. They do not seek admiration, because admiration once felt dangerous. What they protect most carefully is not capital, but internal stability. In the end, their wealth reveals less about success, and more about survival refined into quiet control.